Hello and welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast for Tuesday, February 11th, 2020. My name is Tom Luongo. We've got a lot to talk about. This is episode 20, and I have with me today, it's a very great pleasure of mine to have someone who has taught me so much about Russian politics and geopolitics and all of these things that we discuss here on a regular basis. Andrei Raevsky, who writes under the name The Saker over at his blog, The Vineyard of the Saker, at www.thesaker.is. Andrei is a wealth of information of Russian history and geopolitics and all of those other things. And I can't be happier to have him here with me today. Andrei, thank you so much for doing this and welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, but please remember, I am a student of history, not a wealth of information. So don't overrate me.
Fair enough.
I'm just trying to figure out things.
You, me, and everybody else. And if we're not trying to figure things out, then why are we still here?
Exactly.
Why don't we? So the quest for knowledge is the only thing that keeps us, in my mind, keeps us going during the day. So that's great. That's awesome. It's fantastic. So today, I talked with Alexander Mercouris of the Duran a couple of weeks ago about the changeover in the Russian government, or at least the changes that are happening within the Russian government that President Putin has set in motion. I wanted to get your perspective on that because I got an Alexander's perspective. I thought it'd be interesting to get your perspective as well, at least as a jumping off point so that we can get to know each other and go from there. So we'll start there. To me, it looks like a very positive thing. I think you wrote an article said that this isn't a revolution in Russian politics, but more of an evolution. And that was kind of the way I saw it as well. So if you just want to, expound on that a little bit, we'll just start and go from there.
Well, I guess the key operating assumption that I have when I look at what happened since Putin came to power in 2000 is that there were at least two factions existing within the Russian government. Now, these are not organized factions. They don't have, cards. They don't have separate meetings. It's obviously not a formal organization. It's an informal one. People who have a specific mindset or, say, a corporate culture. One group I call the Atlantic integrationists. These are the people that wanted to integrate Russia into what's called the Atlantic Security Network or system. It's basically wants Russia to be part of the West and to be treated as an equal partner by the West. These are the folks who are generally coming out of Russian business, energy sector, Gazprom being one of them, but there are many others, the banking sector. It is basically where money was. And the second strong group that was already existing as early as 1999 would be what I called, again, arbitrarily Eurasian sovereignists. These are people who think that the future of Russia is Eurasia, not the West. And that's a crucial difference. It doesn't mean that these people are anti-Western, it just means that their priorities is, for the first time, I would argue, in 300 years. Right. A group of Russian leaders are looking to the south, the east, and the north, and not to the west as a main priority. And that group wants to achieve full sovereignty. Now, these two groups existed throughout the past couple of decades. The first group was more sort of its sphere of interest. They wanted to deal with the Russian economy. They're primarily economists. That's what floats their boat. And they got that portfolios, whereas the second group got the national security portfolios, defense, foreign affairs, intelligence, etc. Mm-hmm. And what happened, and what has been happening, is that for Russia, the foreign let's say how shall I put it? The entire complex of problems associated with the abroad was much more important for many years. It's changing now for the first time. But basically, the second group was much more visible and was much more popular. Mm-hmm. So the issue was, when would unpopular people would eventually be told to show to the door, and be replaced? And everybody was waiting, not everybody, but a lot of people were waiting for it, including myself, and that did not happen when mm-hmm. Putin was reelected, and it happened this time, so it's interesting. And some people were expecting a real purge, that all the pro-Western elements would be completely sacked overnight. That hasn't happened either. Right. Medvedev has received an honorific position at the Security Council. What's his name? The Minister of Economics, I have a blank right now, hasn't changed.
Right.
So
Sulianov? Are we talking about Sulianov?
Yes, Sulianov, exactly. Thank you. Mm-hmm. So it wasn't, a massive sort of Stalin-like purge. It was what Putin has been doing since he came to power, which is a gradual, sometimes frustratingly gradual, but evolution. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Russia had enough revolutions, I think.
And that was the way I saw it. And you've made the point many times, and I've seen it as well, which is that Putin has a serious fifth column problem that he's had to deal with. I remember going back to 2015 when he was offline. It was 2015, if I remember correctly, that he went offline for about 3 weeks. And from what I understand, he had to, deal with a coup within the Kremlin.
That nobody really knows. That was a speculation that it was not based on anything but wild guesses.
Sure, I heard it from Martin Armstrong as well, who apparently still, or at least fronts that he has contacts within the Kremlin. So even if that rumor is only half true, it's still one of those things where it's just an example of it's the fifth column that he has to deal with. And from my perspective as an outsider watching it in the last, over the course of the last, I've been watching it seriously since about 2013 or so, 2012 really. And to me, it's been very obvious that it's the financial sector that he's had to work. That's what he's been working on since then in this time period, because those are the ones that have been doing the most foot dragging about asserting Russia's sovereignty on the international stage. So I remember when Glazyev was added to his Council of Economic Advisors, for example. I remember I know that there's been at least 2 different moments where he's had to dress down the head of the Russian Central Bank, Elvira Nabiulina, over her foot dragging about lowering interest rates when she was just actively trying to destroy the economic recovery in Russia post ruble crisis in 2015, 2014, 2015. So, I think you and I are in agreement about that observation.
Yes, but I would like to add one very important factor in all this.
Sure.
We tend to think as the Kremlin as something kind of isolated behind big, thick walls, and what happens there is this mysterious thing. But I'll tell you why I don't believe that there was a coup attempt against Putin. It has nothing to do with the National Guard or, the Kremlin regiment. It has to do with Putin's popularity. His popularity is the basis of his real power.
Right.
Because right now there's absolutely nobody coming even near him in terms of credibility and reputation, etc. Right. Anybody who would be contemplating a coup, of course, would have to, take control of the Kremlin and somehow kick him out and his allies out. But then would be the phase 2, which is what you tell the people. Yeah. And I think what we would have a pathetic repeat of the GKChP, the coup against that was attempted to restore the Soviet Union, which ended up, being embarrassing to even look at as a coup. Right. I don't think there are elements in the Kremlin right now that would dare move against Putin. So that's why I do not see any basis to think that there was a coup attempt against Putin that he had to crush. Because if he had to deal with it, the people who would have organized it would have then had to deal with the public opinion, and the public opinion would never accept that.
Right. No, that makes sense. And it's part of the reason why I think in is an analogous situation to what's happening with Donald Trump here in the United States with his impeachment. Now, I was very vocal in telling people, look, don't count your chickens before they're hatched. There's a very good chance here that these people are going to buck public opinion very hard and try and take Trump out. But at the same time, what was happening was a hardening of his support domestically, not because his foreign policy is any good, which you and I both agree. I'm sure we can agree is frankly terrible. But because his projection of a domestic agenda of America, for lack of a better term, Trump is pretty easy to understand. And he's pretty easy for American voters to understand, which is that he loves America and he was duly elected. And this whole impeachment and Russiagate thing is just completely unfair and ridiculous. And he's been very persuasive in making that argument and using that in order to maintain what political power he actually has, even though he's been a captured pawn in so many ways. And whether or not and to the extent that he's a captured pawn is always, the interesting part about Trump. But certainly from a domestic policy perspective, that's that. So it's an analogous situation that the impeachment was never going to materialize as anything other than the biggest domestic policy own goal of all time. Yeah. And but there was always that slim chance that they were going to not care about that, and that they understood that, and they were still going to do it anyway. And
Yeah.
that to me would have been indicative of their complete and utter desperation of having lost control of the narrative and control of everything else. So I personally just felt very strongly that it was necessary to continue to say that, even though in my heart of hearts I didn't believe he was going to be removed from power. So
Yeah,
same thing about, I think that this is a similar thing that happened with Putin certainly back in 2015 when his popularity was above 80%, right? And it was crazy.
Yes.
It was off the
And
charts.
keep in mind that he also has very firm control over what's called in Russian, we say power ministries. It's those, who actually have force, military, intelligence, National Guard, internal affairs, all this. He has surrounded himself with people who will be loyal to him. They would never be able to actually have there is no force in Russia right now that can take over the Kremlin. It's just going to happen.
Yeah, right. So that makes perfect sense. So let's shift. So as far as the organization or reorganization of the Russian government that we're seeing, do you have any specific criticisms of what Putin's done, or do you think this is it's an evolution, but is it do you feel he's going in the right direction, or is it too slow, too fast? Obviously. So
I am an idealist and an impatient person, so I always wanted more, faster, better, quicker. But frankly, I mean, every time he has been slow, to my appreciation, he ended up being right at the end of the day.
Sure.
So, no, actually, I'm very happy with the way it happened. I'm happy that there was a clear move.
Right.
And by the way, in Russia, the consensus is among analysts that the fifth column, if you want to call them that, are in very, very bad shape now. Yeah. They really have been dealt a huge coup. And I tend to agree with that. I'm a little bit more cautious maybe that some people in Russia were saying basically it's over for them. I don't think it's quite over, but it's pretty darn close to over, because right now the power is in his hands. My big concern is what comes after. Right. And that's totally unclear to me.
Yeah, no,
I hope he has something in mind. I really do. He probably does.
I think so. I mean, one of the things that Alexander Mercouris brought up was that the strengthening the Council of Regions and the Security Council and turning that into kind of a foreign policy incubator laboratory, incubator body. This is how Mercouris, I think, put it to me. That seems like a very strong play from his perspective, because it also puts it in that leaves it as a place where he can go after he leaves the stage. He leaves the stage as president, and that he's not going to leave public life. He's Vladimir Putin, and he's still going to be he'll be in his early 70s by then. Or is he in his early 70s by then? And he's a very vital man. He's in very good shape physically and mentally and everything else. And a man like that is not going to sit still and just accept his retirement. I think that the idea of him moving into that position as not an ambassador, but certainly as an advisor, as a prominent advisor to run the Council of Regions, I think is an interesting insight that Mercouris had, and I think that may be what's part of his plan, and that leaves him in a position that if he is grooming for lack of a better term, redeemed Dmitry Medvedev as his successor as president, but leaving Putin in a position to advise strongly on foreign policy, that may be the best of both worlds. It may be possible that works out. I don't know. So just something to think about. Mm-hmm. I know you're not Medvedev's biggest fan, and well, you shouldn't be. But it may be possible.
Well, all I know is that whoever succeeds him will need vitally his imprimatur in terms of just political. So even if Putin had no function whatsoever, if he became a retiree with no official capacity, he would be similar to the Emperor of Japan, which has no legal right but has a huge moral authority.
Exactly.
So Putin, no matter what he does, will remain the de facto leader in Russia. That's, to me, there's a lot in my mind, barring some extraordinary event.
Mm-hmm. And the interest and the extraordinary events that could take place would be infiltration from outside of Russia, i.e., from the United States, from for lack of a better term, the Five Eyes, the French, UK, United States, Israeli faction that absolutely. The factions within those governments was absolutely still like they live, eat, breathe, and poop Russophobia, like their Russian hatred is so obvious. But the interesting part about it is I think that's actually in retreat everywhere with the exception of Israel. So I don't think it's happened. I think in the United States Senate, it's still Russian haters occupied territory, for lack of a better term. But I think Donald Trump exists as a signal that at a popular level, the United States is looking for that, and is looking for that kind of rapprochement. And I think that we may be seeing the early stages of a change happening within British political elite as well, because I think Brexit changes everything we know about the Brits in a kind of functional way, and that leaves the EU in kind of limbo, having signed on to all of this, and then all of a sudden, the US and the UK may be moving in an opposite direction, at least at the leadership level. And then, there's still a lot of cleanup that has to be done at the foreign intelligence level and all that. But I think the beginnings of these things are in evidence. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm more skeptical here. First of all, the U.S. political system depends on having a boogeyman with which to scare
Agreed.
The people. So, if it's not Dr. Fu Manchu, it's going to be the communists. If it's not the communists, it's the Muslims. If it's not the Muslims, it's marijuana. It doesn't matter. You have to have terrorists and threatens, and
I agree.
And in order to then tell that we owe a deep debt of gratitude to the veterans who protect our freedoms. That.
Oh, absolutely.
So once you remove that myth, you're left with nothing. So that's first of all why I'm dubious that there's going to be much of an improvement. Secondly, I have never seen Trump since he was elected actually holding an independent line. The best I can say for him, and I did credit him for that, is that he didn't start a war until last year. In 1919, he didn't start a war, for which I'm very grateful to him, because if you realize what a war is, then it's the absolute argument. Yeah. So he did not start a war. That's the best I can say about him. But in terms of his language or rhetoric, is he willing to work with Russia normally? Is he even capable of there's this Russian expression, недоговороспособный, which means non-agreement capable.
Yes.
Trump can say A, and then the next moment he says B. You can't have an agreement. You can't have a partnership with people who are that finicky and that unable to hold on to a policy.
Now, your use of that phrase, non-agreement capable, I'm glad you brought it up, is something I've quoted like a dozen times in the last 4 or 5 years, because it was so good when you wrote that article. I remember I can literally still remember that article because you wrote it to explain what Putin was saying about how to deal with the United States, and he and Lavrov both used that phrase in relation to the United States. And I agree with you. I don't think Trump is agreement capable. It doesn't mean that the beginnings of a new era aren't taking shape here. And I'm just very subtle here, Andre. I'm not saying that the United States is going to tomorrow, that Trump is going to open up, is going to end the sanctions or anything like that. No, it's going to be terrible for the next 5 years at a minimum. But the bigger issue here is that I also think that the United States, as it's currently politically constituted, is not long for this life. I think that you and I will be having this conversation from a potentially independent Florida 10 years from now. Or 12 years.
I completely agree with you. I absolutely agree with you. And I think that the U.S., I always say, the condition of the U.S. today reminds me of the Soviet Union of the 80s,
right,
where there was a huge system that looked almighty, all powerful, had, tons of rockets and KGB and whatever.
Right.
In reality, when it fell so fast, nobody even made an effort to protect it. Nothing.
No, because
it collapsed like overnight.
Yeah, and I think that that's what's going to happen here. There's going to come a point. I think that we come to a point in the near future that California doesn't want to be part of the United States, of a system that that allows Floridians to have their guns, or that Floridians don't want to be in a union with Connecticut that wants the Stasi. And because they just passed a law that's literally like creating a Stasi in Connecticut. I'm like, in Connecticut? Of all places. I grew up in upstate New York. I mean, I've been to Connecticut. Like, why would we need a Stasi in Connecticut? Because it's like, it's the most placid place in the world. I don't get.
I can tell you exactly why there's a need for a Stasi in Connecticut.
Sure.
Because the folks who are in power, all they know how to is organize Stasis. It doesn't depend on Connecticut. It depends on the folks in power.
No, absolutely.
They would put a Stasi in a nursery. No problem.
Lovely. Outstanding. Well said. So, I agreed completely. Remember, hardcore anarcho-libertarian on this side of the microphone. So, but all of that in context, if you start to really begin to look at, taking all that into consideration, it then makes sense that the American people are and just like any national, we're talking about any nation, be it the Russian people or Russia or the United States, or we look at what happened in Britain, for Christ's sakes. Nigel Farage almost single-handedly shepherded the UK out of the EU without ever winning an election. It's the most amazing thing I think we can have, amazing political event of our lifetimes. And except for, of course, the fall of the Soviet Union, Berlin. I think, but all of these things are very, very similar in terms of their impact on how the world is going to be, how the world's going to change over the course of the rest of our lifetimes. Because I'm just turned 52. I'm not sure how old you are. And how much?
56.
Okay, so we're of an age. And the Russophobia and the insanity that has gripped the United States at this point in time, this new Cold War, I don't think lasts Trump's second term. I don't think it lasts in Congress. I think with a generational shift that's beginning to take place now, I don't think it lasts. I don't think my generation, remember, I know you're Russian. I'm like quintessentially American Generation X. I'm like the poster child for it. And we have no patience for any of this stuff. We're looking at this going, we're broke. You people, you feckless boomers have ruined everything. And like, we have to pay for it all. Like, we're not going to play these political games. And the millennials coming behind us are going to be like, look, you want to leave? Leave. We're not going to fight a civil war to prevent Florida secession. We're just not going to do it. Or California secession. They're going to be like, yeah, leave. Like that, because that's their ethos. Their ethos is not integrationist. Their ethos is not that at all. I don't believe. And they may be falling to the siren's call of fake socialism, but they're not falling for the siren's call of empire. And that's fundamentally different. And I think that mindset over the course of the next 15 to 20 years, certainly if we go through a financial crisis of any significant size, which I absolutely believe we're looking at, then I just look at this going, yeah, the United States are going to have much different priorities than being angry with Russia in 10 years. And for that reason, things are going to change. So
I see two good reasons to be angry with Russia. The first one is that Russia is not militarily, cannot be defeated militarily by the West, which is extremely frustrating because most countries on the planet were defeated militarily. Mm-hmm. So that's reason number one. And secondly, the fact that Russia is culturally different. Russia is not just a Russian-speaking version of Germany, France, or the UK. It's a completely different cultural and civilizational realm. And I think that's one that's actually willing to resist. Mm-hmm. So here you have two reasons to hate Russia. Russians have the will to resist and have the means to resist.
I think you can extend that, because I was speaking to Alistair Crook last week about this very thing. As a matter of fact, we did a podcast and I named it, the United States and the Civilizational War of the U.S. and Israel, and because that's what we talked about. And at that level, and he identified this as a civilizational level war at the ideological level for the United States against Russia, against Iran, and against China. And now they're all three of these civilizational powers, these nodes of anti-U.S. civilizational power, are in alignment.
And yet, notice that all three are completely different. We're talking about Russia economically is to my regret, still a liberal, kind of capitalist democracy. China is state enterprise capitalism, and Iran is an Islamic republic.
I know.
Yet they work together just fine. And you add really, some kind of rogue element like Erdogan, who half of the time does work with Russia and half doesn't, and somehow they still talk to each other. And even Israel is part of that. Really, if you look at it, they're very much they're part of that group too.
Of course, no. I think Putin's deft handling of Israel is one of the things that people should be lauding him, as opposed to what is happening. No, absolutely. As opposed to what the alt-right and the alt-right jerk-offs here in the United States want to believe that he's actually a stooge of the Jews and all this stuff. I'm like, but these are the same people that in my realm, the financial realm, will make the argument that all the central bankers in the world are all closet Austrian economists. They're all closet Rothbardians, and that they manipulate the Austrian business cycle to make to build to extend their power base. I'm like, no, they're really just incompetent Keynesians with a lot of power. Like, stop. The rabbit hole doesn't go that deep. It's not. You're wrong. And we humans are really good at pattern recognition, and we're really good at seeing these things. But sometimes we have to remind ourselves, nope, stop. Smack each other upside the head and say, no, that's not reality. Reality is far different from that. Just because you have one piece of information that says X, you're ignoring the 9,000 pieces of information that say Y. And I think that's
exactly what is happening.
Yeah, it's insane. That's why I do absolutely recommend everybody listening today that you read the Saker's latest article about Russia's relationship with the Jews, for the lack of a better term, because it's a very, very good nuanced look at the history of Russian people, Russian Jews, and all this. I thought it was fascinating. I read it this morning in preparation for this talk to make sure that I
tell you, I got a lot of hate mail over it.
Oh, well,
a lot.
Good. I got a lot of hate mail over Trump's handling Trump killing Soleimani. So guess what?
Yeah.
I think I might have almost screwed the pooch on my new gig with writing a newsletter for Newsmax over it. I did a podcast, and my audience did not like that at all, and I had to kind of issue a non-apology apology, which is about the only kind of apology under that circumstance I would ever give. So if I'm wrong, I'm wrong, and I'll be happy to apologize. But I was not wrong about how that laid out. I was just wrong about how I presented it. So I apologize for that. And apparently all things are better. So we're good to go.
Yes.
There. So all right. So speaking of that stuff, and speaking of what's going on in Syria, and and speaking of that, I want to shift gears to Syria/Iraq, because the battle for Idlib, I think, to me, it's fait accompli. I'm not following it on a day-to-day basis, but I think it's very interesting to see the moves that are being made in relation to that by everybody else. So the moves that Israel keeps trying to make, the moves that Erdogan is making in Turkey are off the charts, and then how that relates to the civilizational struggle that we just outlined or just discussed. To me, I think that situation is very interesting. So I know you have a lot of thoughts about Russia's relationship with Israel and how it relates to their military policy in Syria. And if you want to, take that ball and run with it, I'm happy to sit back and listen.
Well, I will actually compare, to some extent, the relationship that Russia has with Israel, the one it has with Turkey. Mm-hmm. Because both the Turkish leadership and the Israelis suffer from megalomania, and they have to maintain this, in the Turkish case, this imperial Ottoman kind of grandeur. In the case of Bibi Netanyahu, the kind of typical racist supremacism that we hear from the Israelis. And that conditions their policy very, very much, because when your top priority, your political imperative is to always restore your superiority, that image that we can get away with whatever the hell we want, is something, when that is crucial, it makes you do very dumb things. The two examples that come to my mind is that Turkey announcing that they're sending forces to Libya, and then you really look what it is, and these are advisors who will help them with systems, will not participate in combat, and I think the total amount initially announced was 12 people. I mean, it was nothing. It was hardly a reconquest by the Ottoman Empire of Libya.
Right.
And Israel is doing something very similar. They constantly bomb either the Gaza Strip or targets in Syria and Iraq, but somehow nobody seems to be asking, well, what's the point? What do these attacks yield, actually, militarily? And the reason why this question is not asked, because they yield militarily absolutely nothing.
Right.
They are completely useless. And the reason why they're useless, because, first of all, the Syrians got very good at the correct way of dealing with strikes is to deny targets, not use air defense. And that's the first, if you want, how shall I put it, the first edge of defense is don't present a good target. The second one then is those targets that are crucial, defend them well. And those who are not crucial, well, they get secondhand. That's pretty much what you have in terms of air defense in Syria. And that's what the Israelis are doing. They're hitting on the periphery trying to still reassert that Israeli meme about Arabs only understand force, we are invincible, and we will teach them until they get it.
Right.
It has nothing to do with what's really going in reality. Compare that with Iran, who has no megalomania whatsoever. They don't make these loud statements. They just do their stuff.
Right.
And they get stuff done. And I would say to some degree, Russia is very similar to Iran in that point of view, is that they won't announce, they will just do things. So coming back to Syria, what do we have? We have the US and Israel, who don't want the war to stop, and they do have the means to kindle a low level of violence in the country in different spots. That's something that neither the Syrians nor the Russians will probably be able to completely stop.
Right.
But in terms of meaningful military moves, it's over for them.
Yeah.
Syria managed to beat them back, and they can try to go into deep denial like they're doing it in Afghanistan, but it's not going to change the reality on the ground.
Right. Not at all.
And the reality on the ground is it's over.
Yeah.
And I frankly think it's over for Iraq too. I can tell you why if you want.
Oh no, yeah. Let's. Well, all I'm going to say is I agree. I agree with you. I came to that conclusion about a year and a half ago. I think it was very obvious. I think once Aleppo fell, actually, so I guess that would be over 2 years now, that it was just a matter of cleanup from that point forward. Because I remember the battle for the Coeris Air Base. It was like the first major battle of the war. Yeah. After the Russians and after Russia moved in with their air force, and I remember Pepe Escobar writing about it, and I looked at him and went, oh yeah, they take the Coeris Air Base. Eventually Aleppo was going to fall, and then they took the control of the Conasar Highway, and then they took care of this, and once they started carving up these important supply routes, resupply routes, it became just a matter of winning. And it was interesting. I read a great article this morning that Pepe Escobar sent me a link to by Radoslav Pashenko about the differences between American military strategy, anaconda, encirclement, and stifling, cutting off, and the Russians who use cauldrons. The Russians weaken lines, they use cauldrons, and they take specific areas, and they don't try and take the whole country back at once. They say, we're going to take this right here. And he linked to my podcast that I did on this very subject, which was unbelievably generous of him to do. And but that's what I see playing out here, is that very, very methodically the Russians and the Syrians and Iran in Syria are just methodically breaking Idlib down bit by bit by bit by bit by bit, and Turkey has no response to this, because what are they going to do? Start an open war with the Russians, who are their energy benefactors and everything else? Of course they're not. Are they going to try and foment some kind of weird Article 5 moment to get NATO involved, like they tried with the IL-20 Elan plane getting shot down, which is I firmly believe that was France and the UK doing that. No, none of that is on the table anymore. So Syria is, from that perspective, over. There's not going to be a NATO Article 5 moment. So that's over. So now the question is, how do they deal with Iraq? And so that's the next thing. So yeah. So if you want to talk about that, I firmly believe that Iraq is the important battleground in the war as it stands right now. Syria is a mop-up operation, and now we deal with Iraq. So go ahead and take it from there.
I completely agree with that. It's happening now in Iraq because Iraq is the rear base. It's vital to CENTCOM.
Right.
And it's also a very, very strong political statement. It's one thing to be thrown out of Afghanistan. It's quite another one to have, I don't want to say the figure, but anywhere between 1 to 5 million people in the streets saying Yankee go home. Mm-hmm. At that point, and that's another thing that I would say since at least 2001, American leaders have completely neglected, which is the importance of diplomacy. You have to understand that the U.S. military is completely boxed in on two sides. On one side, they're boxed in simply by not having basically the entire military strategy and force deployments of the U.S. is not what the U.S. needs at all. Mm-hmm. So you have a force that's structured in a way that's not going to get anything done for you. And secondly, military force should always be accompanied by and supported by diplomacy.
I agree.
You always should talk to even your enemy and the bad guy. That's a basic thing. You don't have to do it publicly. You don't have to say good things about the other guy, but you need to talk.
Mm-hmm.
When all you're doing is delivering certificates of human rights compliance or sanctions, that's not diplomacy. That's nothing.
No.
And no amount of military power will fix these kinds of limitations on U.S. foreign policy. That's why I really think that there is no U.S. foreign policy. Mm-hmm. My position is that there is no U.S. foreign policy whatsoever. There's foreign policy of the CIA, of the White House, of the neocons, of the Israel lobby, of the oil lobby, of the military-industrial complex. You name it. They all have policies. But I don't see, at least I don't distinguish anything that I could call a U.S. foreign policy. It's not there.
Right. No, that makes that's an interesting insight. I'm not sure I completely agree with it, but it's a very interesting way of looking at it. I think I'm a little bit more cynical about my about my homeland when it comes to that. I think the foreign policy of the United States is chaos. I still think that stupid Mackinder Heartland theory, which is completely discredited, resurrected as Brzezinski doctrine and the Wolfowitz doctrine and everything else. But it's the same garbage that Halford Mackinder put forward 150 years ago. I still think that that's the goal, which is that at the end of the day, if we win if everybody else is running around trying to stop us from creating chaos. And the problem with that strategy is that it's incredibly expensive. And it's bankrupting and destroying and hollowing out the United States here at home. No matter how much Trump likes to talk about, GDP growth, and I point out to him all the time, I'm like, dude, GDP is just gross national spending. It's not gross national product, it's gross national spending. It's a measure of spending. Well, when you spend $1.3 trillion more than you earn as the government, you can make GDP look like whatever you want it to look like. But the truth of the matter is that in real GDP growth terms, we saw about $400 billion in actual GDP growth last year. So it was $900 billion last year alone thrown into the ether. Gone.
Yes.
I agree. At the end of the day, I mean, these are just rough numbers. I used these for a recent newsletter just to say, look, in these terms, we've destroyed, torched, whatever you want to call it, almost $1 trillion in capital last year alone, and that has to be paid for in the form of your time, my time, a Ford plant worker in Michigan or Mexico time, everybody's time. So a nurse in Kalamazoo, it doesn't matter. Everybody's time gets wasted, and at the end of the day, that's all lost capital. Remember, capitals, I think in those terms, but it's lost savings.
But let me ask you this:
it's lost human potential, and that lost human potential will eventually be paid for, and the whole thing has to collapse. You have to issue debt for it, and it's even worse than that. It's worse than you've lost that capital. You've misallocated to the point where you still have to pay for it in the future. So it's a real loss of almost $2 trillion, and we're compounding that every year.
But how is that a policy? That's what I agree with what you're describing. Empirically, that's what we're seeing. But is that a policy or is it a lack of policy?
That's a fair question.
Because policy, policy is towards achieving some kind of objective. And the objective is not just to ruin the country. I mean, there must be something else.
Well, the goal is that their thinking is that if no one else is allowed to rise, then we maintain our status as the unipolar power that has won the civilizational conflict. And I think that's the way.
Clearly doesn't work.
I know it doesn't work, but it hasn't stopped them yet. They're clearly also insane. So, I mean, I
agree. Therefore, I don't call that a policy. I call that a lack of policy.
Fair enough. I'm trying to argue logic with a Russian. I'm gonna lose since I'm Italian, and that's just not gonna work. So, fair enough. I'll cede your argument. We have a non.
Well, let me give you another one.
Yeah, fair enough.
I don't see who would be actually making that policy. What I see is I use the example of mathematical vectors. Is that everybody pushes his own sort of its own policy, individuals or institutions, and then what you have as a resulting vector, which it's a resulting vector, but that's not a policy. Yeah. That's a resulting vector. Again, there's nobody ever formulated and said, we need to go from here towards here. That's what is so conspicuously absent in the political discourse today. There is no project. There is no plan.
I love this, actually, Andre. This is fantastic. So what you're saying is the vector cross product of all of the various factions of the U.S. deep state sums to zero.
Yes. It sums to a resulting vector which can change and changes constantly, but that explains how we can have the U.S. Air Force bomb CIA allies in Syria.
Yes.
You end up having completely absurd situations.
And now I invoke Joseph Heller and the only good book he ever wrote. Catch-22. You're absolutely right. That's a great description of this. And I have a friend of mine who's a very good foreign policy guy and a very good political analyst. And he reminds me all the time. He's like, Tom, you tend to want to like assume that there's some kind of directional force to this, so some kind of causality to a lot of these things. That's actually not there. I'm like, that's a fair criticism. I'm okay with that. I'm going to continue to run with that thesis until proven otherwise. This was a very good proof, Andre. I appreciate that. That was good. I enjoyed that. So the lack of U.S. policy is our policy, and so that makes it. We now live in a postmodern kind of foreign policy hellhole.
Yes.
That's brilliant. That's grand. And I should have been able to see it that way, but I like it. I work with that works for me beautifully. Okay, so this is why ultimately I think if we continue to do this, because there's no overarching policy, because the politics are so entrenched and corrupt and having failed here at home, there's no way for anybody to grab control of the policy and shift it in a different direction and try and get a hold of it and guide it on a course. We're just being thrown stem to stern every day by whatever crazy thing comes out of Nancy Pelosi's mouth is given by George Soros or whomever it is. And this is what we deal with. And that anybody actually listens to a word that Nancy Pelosi says at this point is frankly offensive, because the woman is clearly not in her right mind and not functioning with any kind of capacity.
Well, I think what we have is what Chris Hedges brilliantly calls the empire of illusions.
Yes.
I think that's it. Illusions matter much more, and it's the same thing with Israel again. Mm-hmm. Illusions matter much more than actual facts on the ground.
Yeah.
That's a bad place to be in. Once your delusions are more important than reality around you, you know there's an expression, when your head is in the sand, your ass is in the air.
That's right. Exactly.
And that's what happens.
And what's interesting about this, and I try to explain this to say this to people all the time. I say, I can be sympathetic to why Israel has done what it's done. I can look at it in a non-conspiratorial, Zionist, crazy. I can look at Israel's position very simply, which is to say that the neoconservatives have been ascendant here in the United States, and Israel understands that its position is very tenuous in the Middle East. And therefore, what do? You attach yourself to the dominant power within the dominant power. Yes. So the dominant political faction within the dominant power, the hyperpower on the planet is that. And so you do your best to infiltrate that as much as possible in order to just stabilize your own situation. And that makes perfect sense to me. There's no conspiracy here. There's no crazy ideology of, Jewish uber alles or anything along those lines, none of that stuff. There's just this basic everyday enlightened self-interest, right? So, okay, from that perspective, but they have to realize that that's shifting, that hyperpower and its ability to do all this is over. And so now what do? And they really need to start looking at the people who are surrounding them and going, if you don't change the way you're doing things, you are going to get wiped out. Because the generations, as I said earlier, the generations coming behind in the United States are never going to be the same kind of stalwart ally for you, because they don't see the thing in the same kind of civilizational war perspective that the baby boomers.
I would add one thing, though. I agree with you on Israel, but I don't necessarily completely agree on the neocons, because I don't think they care about Israel one bit.
No, I don't think they do either.
I think they identified an ideology which is very, very, that's easy to instrumentalize, this ideology, to make it an ideology that basically is an infinite quest for power. Mm-hmm. And it makes perfectly good sense. If you separate mankind into two groups and you say that one group is hell-bent on genociding the second group, then the second group has to make sure that the first group can't do that. Mm-hmm. And that's the basic rationalization for this entire notion of a state for the Jews. It implies the very existence of Israel is an implied statement saying, we don't trust you all, the rest of you, to not live normally with our people. We need to find a safe place for them. right there, you've divided humanity into two groups. After that, it's a great ideology to justify whatever you want under it. But I think it's a raw quest for power at the end of the day. I don't believe these neocons give a damn about Israel. They don't.
No, it's a pure postmodernist power world.
Yes,
absolutely.
Very much so.
They absolutely are. At the end of the day, they're Sartre, Derrida, French postmodernist Marxists. They just dress it up in other things. But at the end of the day, that's exactly who they are. And I've never thought of them as anything else other than that. So, and they're the dangerous evolution of Marxist criticisms of the Industrial Revolution into something very, very ugly and very, very dangerous, which is frankly modern postmodernism. So, and we have the French to thank for that. So, unfortunately, and then it manifests itself in all of these very, very heinous people here as the United States for foreign non-policy. I will make sure that I use that phrase from here on out. So yeah, no, and I just think I think it's sad. And one of the things that I know that I talk about all the time, and my regulars talk about amongst ourselves all the time, is that Israel has to realize that they have a very short time window to get everything that they're going to get from the United States in terms of I hate to use the word Gibbs, but to get the concessions that they need and the help that they're going to need to survive what's coming. But in the process, under Netanyahu, they're ensuring that the people who are standing are the barbarians at the gates, for lack of a better term, aren't going to have any sympathy for them. And that's the part I don't understand. And that's the part of me that says that Netanyahu and his ilk are the problem, and they need to be removed. And the question is, will the Israeli people wake up early enough?
I think, unfortunately, not. I think the majority of the Israeli people completely buy into the Judaic and Zionist racial superiority myth. They are messianic. There's a profound reason why a messianic country like the U.S. and a messianic country like Israel, essentially fuse their messianism together into one.
Yeah,
they literally cannot conceive. You can give them all the facts you want. You can say, "Look, this dam is about to burst. We've calculated it," and they're going to say, "No, we are in control." And that's the same. I think the leadership is very similar in both countries right now.
Yeah, no,
totally out of touch with reality.
I sadly think the same thing, and the only question I have is that, and this is where I appreciate people like Putin and Rouhani and others who see all of this. They see it for what it is, and they call it out on a regular basis.
Absolutely,
and they also show temperance and forbearance during all of this. It's actually quite impressive when you if you analyze it from this perspective. And I know that for a lot of Americans, now most of the Americans who are going to listen to this podcast are going to be in sympathy with our worldview, because that's my audience. But understand that this is a very difficult way of looking at the world. But like everything else, we know as Americans that there's something deeply wrong, and there's something deeply not right with the direction that we're headed. And no amount of virtue signaling and demonizing the Democrats, even though they deserve every opprobrium that you pile on them, because they are terrible, terrible people, at least at the leadership level. But at the same time, you realize that you have to still maintain some amount of self-reflection. And if you want to survive this as a culture, or even as some form of the political, a vestige of the political and cultural wealth that we had at some point, that if we're going to do that, we have to be willing to be self-reflective of our mistakes. And it's sadly not been part of the American mindset for an awfully long time. And this is not just in my lifetime. This goes way, way back.
Absolutely.
And it's a shame that Hamilton won the fight. I'll be honest with you. This is the Hamiltonian worldview versus there's the Jeffersonian worldview. It goes right back to that. It goes back to me still lamenting the failure of the Articles of Confederation. So because the Constitution's too strong a document. So if you want my honest opinion. But it is what it is, and unfortunately, I don't know that that's going to change. And I don't know if I don't know if that's going to happen or not. And I hope that it does. But like everything else, I hope that if it doesn't happen, that the economic excesses force that reevaluation before anything catastrophic happens. Let's just put it that way. That's what I'm hoping for.
Yeah, unfortunately, my sense is that in most cases it takes a catastrophe to really open the eyes of the people. I mean, just look at Russians. Of course. Let's be honest. I remember McDonald's in Moscow, in the early 90s. There was a line going all around Pushkin Square to just have the privilege to partake of these beautiful things.
Right.
That was Russia in the 1990s. Look what happened 30 years later. 30 years is nothing in terms of human history. It's instantaneous practically. So I think, all countries go through that. It's a profound identity crisis, and then you basically become post-imperial in your thoughts. Mm-hmm. And once you do that, it's not that you're a kind person and you don't want empire. You're a smart person. You don't want empire. You realize empire is a curse for the host.
Yes. Absolutely.
Once you get that idea, that's why I always say neither the Chinese or the Russians have any desire to be an empire. There is a mentally unstable constituency of a few percent that want empire, probably.
Of course.
But in terms of real constituency, there is no constituency in Russia right now for empire. No. And I strongly suspect that it's the same thing in China.
Mm-hmm. And I'll be honest with you, Andre. I think that that percentage of people here in the United States is growing, and I make the point that I think the millennials get it. I think they get that empire is costly.
I hope so.
I'm fond of saying because I also watch European politics so carefully because it's what I think is going to be ground zero for the catastrophe that engulfs the world. I'm fond of saying that we Italians have a very tenuous relationship with government because we ruled the world for a long time and realized that it was a bad deal. And now today we just kind of look at government as performance art. And it's just something it's just something that we watch on cable. And not that I speak Italian, not that I'm steeped in Italian culture. Really, I'm firmly American, but I'm an Americanized Italian. But I watch what happens in Italy, and I'm like, yeah, I get that. That makes perfect sense. Because why would they care about any of this stuff? It just seems so silly.
It's silly and it's dangerous, counterproductive. For instance, violence always come back home. It comes home always.
Of course, violence is.
And then there's hell to pay. So.
Yeah, no, the violence is never the solution to any real problem.
Agreed.
It's always the end result of people actively not trying to seek an alternate solution. Yeah. And that's why the military and diplomacy have to go hand in hand. It's why you'll notice in the Russian cabinet shakeup, the two people who were never discussed as having their jobs in trouble were the top diplomat and the head of the Ministry of Defense. So Lavrov and Shoigu, which I was happy to see.
Me too.
I thought both men do a tremendous job because if people think that Putin is some kind of crazy hardliner, they have no idea what's behind him.
Oh no, he's a moderate.
Yeah, he's absolutely a moderate. But he also has I think he has a civilizational view of the world. I think he's a very nuanced view of the world.
I see that? Where I see it very clearly?
Mm-hmm.
And the kind of authors he references in his speeches. He just drops names from time to time.
Right.
But if you know these names, you know that Putin has read these guys.
Right.
And that's an analysis that so far I've never seen anybody in the West do. For instance, he quotes a philosopher called Ivan Ilyin, which is a really important philosopher. That says a lot. If Putin quotes Ilyin, it means he read him. It says a lot about what actually the worldview of Putin is, where he's headed towards. Now, slowly in a reform way, not in a revolutionary way, but that's better.
Well, Putin is a very from a big five pillar of personalities perspective. Putin is a very conscientious man. And because of that, conscientious people tend towards slow change. They understand the damage that change brings. It's like inherently, it's part of their personality. And actually, and because of that, and I'm not a terribly conscientious person. That's not me. And my wife is more than I am. And so she understands this much more than I do.
Same here.
Fair enough. But you can see it. And I want conscientious people leading us out of this. This is why I think Tulsi Gabbard, for example, in the United States, I think is a very interesting political figure if she can muster a power base. Not because I agree with her on policy,
Yes,
but because I see
understand.
her as somebody who's very conscientious and very pragmatic and open to practical solutions to problems, even if those problems are against her worldview. If you can present her better information, she will move. She will move on it, and she's not going to do a lot of harm. She's not going to do. I'll make a lot
No,
of
of course
change
not.
quickly. She's going to make changes in stages, and I think Putin's been very smart in how he's moved Russia from where they were to where they are now. Because honestly, if he had started to move change too quickly, then the entrenched power would have just taken them out.
Probably, yes.
And that.
But I would say it's not only Putin. I mean, people say that he's KGB, which is actually very sort of incorrect because he
Right.
was from a very special department of the KGB for intelligence.
Right.
And it just so happens that over the past, year or so, I've been voraciously reading memoirs of people who were in the Foreign Intelligence Service of the Soviet Union, the PGU of the KGB, that's the official name.
Okay.
And it's very interesting. These guys, they not only knew the West really well because they lived in the West, they
Right.
were also trained to analyze the strong and weak aspects of the West. But what people don't realize is that they also knew very, very well that's the weak aspects of the Soviet Union and the Soviet ideology, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it's very interesting. Putin is a guy who did say that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a major geostrategic calamity. True, but at the same time, he has absolutely zero nostalgia for the Soviet era. And when people start, get nostalgic with him, he quickly starts reminding all the stuff that didn't work during the Soviet era.
Because that statement of his, when put in its proper context, is he always puts it in context. And if you go back and read the whole quote, not just that quote, but he said it was from the perspective of human tragedy. That all of a sudden everybody woke up the next morning and they didn't have a home, they didn't have a country, their passport didn't work, their driver's licenses didn't work. They just at a practical, fundamental, basic, everyday, how do I get to work level?
Yeah,
that's where the tragedy was. It wasn't he was pining for the Soviet Union, the Soviet system.
No, of course not.
It had nothing to do with that. It had everything to do with the actual life of people who all of a sudden woke up one day homeless.
I think most folks at the PGU knew exactly that the system was not viable, and they knew it would collapse.
Mm-hmm.
They warned about it.
Right. I'm sure they did. I
can tell you that for a fact.
Excellent. It's enheartening to hear that. And now the question is, are there people within our CIA making those same recommendations? And that's a good question.
These two institutions are very, very different in culturally.
That's true.
Speaking. So
and that was not me trying to whitewash the CIA in any way. That was me asking an honest question that just popped into my head, which is, okay, is there an analogous situation happening in any level within the CIA? I sincerely doubt it, but go ahead.
Yeah, me too. I hope it exists, but I doubt it.
No,
but you never know. Never say never, Maybe.
No, of course, and always leave yourself open to the possibility that you could be wrong, because obviously, that's why we do things. That's why we have talks like this, where we assume that we don't know anything and are going to learn from the other person that we're chatting with, because it's the only way we ever learn anything. So it's interesting. So with these, we've touched on a lot of things today, which is really kind of cool. So interesting. So we're doing this on the Monday of this week. So here's the last topic, and then I'll let you go. And I'll talk about Germany real quick, because we had the resignation today of Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. I'm going to say her name. We're going to butcher her name. AKK. In Germany, from the head of the head of the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, and that puts Angela Merkel in a very difficult position. Now, we know that the U.S. and the U.K. have been and will almost always be against any kind of German-Russian rapprochement, alliance or whatever. But Germany is the country in the middle, and has been for years. And it's been Merkel's, I think, bad stewardship of Germany that has led it to its current problems. So now the question is, do you see, like I see, the likelihood of a complete collapse of the German center? And
yes,
and what does that actually portend for relations with Russia?
a deeper crisis. Yes, I do see it happening in Germany. I think Germany is sinking really fast. It's paying the price of Merkel's policies, which were,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in my opinion, unequivocally disastrous.
Absolutely.
And there is no avoiding the consequences now. It's too late. So yes,
Mm-hmm.
I do see. Generally, I see Europe as in really, really bad shape.
It is.
I don't see any way that the EU can survive its current crisis. It's bad no matter where you look. The big difference that Brexit is going to make is that there's going to be a big faction and a rich faction of the Russophobes has left the EU. That's the big difference. But frankly, I think the issue is not so much is the EU bad, is it's even interesting for Russia. And I think not really. I think the Russians will be happy to, make the best business they can with the EU in terms of energy, in terms of tourism, in terms of agriculture, whatever. They will not turn their back and start pouting. Right. I just don't think it's that much of a priority. I think they basically think that the EU is collapsing, just as they think the entire West is collapsing, actually. No, and they speak about it very clearly on the Russian media. If you read Russian analysts, they clearly are saying, this is a late stage collapse. And what's the priority for you? Well, you try to, first of all, stay out of the trouble. Don't get sucked in.
Right.
Protect your people physically, then protect them economically, and try to just handle it the best you can until the collapse is over and something else grows out of it. I think that's where the Russians and the Chinese are.
I'll tell you that their willingness, interestingly enough, their willingness to embrace the euro after the United States cut them off from the dollar is an interesting problem. And I tell people all the time, I said, you do realize that a lot of that dollar denominated debt that Russian corporates had that caused such a crisis in the ruble back in 2014 and 2015 has now been redenominated either in rubles or in euros. Yes. And you do realize that the euro is like losing value and is destined for about 80 cents on the dollar, right? You do realize that, right? You do realize that Gazprom doesn't care, for example, that Nord Stream 2 is going to be a year late because of the U.S. being petty.
Right.
Because
they're
going to get 30% back on their money on the loans. They're paid 11 billion. They don't care.
The size of the contracts Russia is signing with China now. They completely dwarf anything with Europe.
Well, yeah, but not to belittle that, but to say also one step further is to say, look, you're going to get this money back. They're not going to cost Gazprom anything in the long run, and then they're going to make it up on the back end in the Ukraine deal that they signed anyway. By the way. Because of the way that contract is structured. Alexander Mercouris, again, had a great insight into that, saying, look, over the course of the 5 years of the Ukrainian transit deal that they just signed, all the lost revenue from this year of Nord Stream 2, they're going to get back over the course of 5 years with the Ukraine, because they're not going to ship gas to Ukraine and by losing money. So they're going to be able to ship it through Nord Stream 2 and make the money on the back end. So they don't care, because to them, pipelines stitch the world together. And the Nord Stream 2 is about tying Europe more tightly to Russia so that Russia is protected. Same thing with Turk Stream. Same thing with the whatever other, they can get 4 trains of Turk Stream built over the course of the next couple of years. That ties all of the Balkans and Eastern Europe, ties Hungary and the Visegráds in, with the exception of Poland, who are a lost cause. So at least as long as law and justice is in charge in that country. So, and that's not going to change, I think, anytime soon. So
not anytime soon. Agreed.
Yeah. So just looking at the poll numbers, I think it's pretty obvious. So, all right, Andre, do you have anything else you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Yes, God help us all. That's all I can say, really. I wrote that 2020, is going to be the perfect storm. We had a big one, the Soleimani thing, which was, we were, I think, after 2017, we've never been so close to war as during that day. That passed, thank God. Let's just hope that the coming crises, because there are going to be many, are all going to be basically, bad, but not bad beyond anything we can survive. Let's just hope for that.
I think I agree with you, and that it's going to be bad, and I'm not expecting it to be in any way good. And I'm prepping my people as much as I possibly can, emotionally, if not financially.
Yes.
to just be ready for the worst, because if you're emotionally prepared for something, then you can react to it without losing your head. It's what we learn it's what we learn in martial arts. So like we practice getting hit in the head so that when it happens to us in real life, we don't freak out. Freak out and like, and then no, you just go, really? Is that it? That's all you got? And then you hit them back, and then and then you move on with your life. So it's the same kind of thing. It's preparation here at that level, and understanding these things. And it's why it's so very important that you do what you do, because you help to illuminate, I think, a society and a culture that we as Americans do not understand. And you do so in a way that I think is incredibly valuable. And I can only hope that you continue to do this for as long as you're capable. And I hope to be able to sit down and chat with you about whatever else comes up in the future.
Do it again.
Yeah, no, I think this was
absolutely.
Yeah, I had a blast, dude. So I'm all good.
Same here.
So, all right, so I'm going to cut it off here. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, and we'll chat again soon. And we'll talk soon.
Okay.
Take care.
Perfect. Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. Remember that you can follow the Saker over at the Unz Review. That's www.unz or unz.com, as well as over at his blog, The Vineyard of the Saker, at www.thesaker.is, where not only he, but a bevy of some of the world's best geopolitical writers congregate. The Saker site is a wealth of excellent analysis and information. Not just the people who write there, but interestingly enough, the comment threads as well. I find them almost as interesting as the articles themselves. So remember that you can also follow me over at my blog at tomluongo.me, as well as follow me on Twitter at TFL1728. YouTube, we do live streams every Monday night at 8 p.m. and every Friday nights at 8:30. And then you can also support the channel and everything that I do over at Patreon/Gold, Goats, and Guns, where you can sign up for either or both the investment newsletter or the private podcast, or what I call biweekly market reports, where we go over technical analysis of major markets as well as some commentary about the news of the day. And that commentary is exclusive to my patrons. All right. Well, that seems like a wrap to me. So I hope you guys have a fantastic week. We will be back next Tuesday. You guys take care. You be well. And keep your stick on the ice.